Welcome to Sierra College's Cybersecurity and Election Interference webinar, one of a series of webinars from our Civic Engagement and Voter Empowerment Project. Our panelists are California Secretary of State Alex Padilla and David Levine. As California Secretary of State, Alex Padilla is focused on modernizing the office, increasing voter registration and participation, and strengthening voting rights. In 2018, he launched the California Motor Voter Program, which automatically registers eligible Californians to vote when they obtain or renew their state ID or driver's license. The program registered 1 million new voters in its first year alone. In November 2019, California reached a record high 20.3 million registered voters. Secretary Padilla also oversaw the 2018 election, in which 64.5% of registered voters cast a ballot, the highest turnout for a gubernatorial election since 1982. Secretary Padilla sponsored legislation in 2015 to establish vote centers, expand early voting, and implement same-day conditional voter registration through the Voters' Choice Act. Previously, he served 2 terms in the San Fernando Valley in the California State Senate and represented East San Fernando Valley on the Los Angeles City Council. He grew up in San Fernando Valley, attended local public schools, and graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a degree in medical engineering. David Levine is the Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Prior to this, David was the Ada County, Idaho Elections Director, where he managed the administration of all federal, state, county, and local district elections in Boise and its environs. He was the Election Management Advisor for the Washington, D.C. Board of Elections. He also served as the Deputy Director of Elections for the city of Richmond, Virginia. David has observed elections overseas in a number of countries for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Haverford College and a Juris Doctor degree from Case Western Reserve University. Our student interviewers are Yulia Tarasova and Camelia Varaste. Yulia Tarasova is one of the 2 Board of Governors student members, as well as the Director of Public Relations for Associated Students of Sierra College. Yulia is majoring in computer science and business with a particular interest in cybersecurity, education, and public service. As a former executive member of the Student Trustee Caucus, she helped to advocate for the introduction of AB 2910, which ensures that all student trustees in the California Community College system have an advisory vote. Camelia Varaste is a journalist and anchor for Sierra College's news site, Roundhouse. She loves researching and telling stories. As an aspiring news anchor, she has a passion for finding out the truth and telling people about it. Camelia also enjoys classical music and is a cellist. She is majoring in journalism and minoring in music. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Yulia will begin our interview.
Thank you, Betty. Welcome, everyone. We are very honored to have you as our guest to provide more insight and knowledge on the common misconceptions and questions that students at Sierra College might have about the cybersecurity during the elections period. Voter fraud, voter suppression, and election interference have been used to describe threats to election integrity. In this webinar, we'll focus on election interference. So how is election interference a threat to our election security and why?
Julia, I'll take a first crack at that. I'm sure the Secretary has a lot to add as well. I think election interference, right, can affect our election security in any number of ways, right? But 2 off the bat, right? One is the ability to influence the electorate. One of the things that we saw in the 2016 presidential election, right, was Russia conducting what amounted to an information warfare campaign, right, to try and influence the electorate, right, sow chaos and confusion, and ultimately, right, try and undermine our democracy. Right. The other piece of that is being able to interfere, right, in our election infrastructure. And one piece of that has been covered at length since 2016 is with regards to our voter registration databases. Right, those are the databases that, right, consist of the voter information of our electorate in terms of where they live, right, and helps determine whether or not ultimately they'll be able to cast, right, a ballot on election day. And we know that, well, while there was no evidence that any data from the voter registration databases was ultimately right, altered or modified, right, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, right, we do know that Russia was in a position, at least in one state, to be able to modify or alter data. And so, I think when we talk about election interference and its impact on election security, we have to think about it at least in two buckets, right? One is the ability to influence the electorate through things like disinformation campaigns, disinformation operations, and social media campaigns, as well as the ability to try and interfere in the election infrastructure, whether we're talking about voter registration databases, the pieces of equipment that people vote on, right, or any other pieces of the election infrastructure.
No, David, I think that's absolutely right. You broke down the buckets. There's the election infrastructure itself, right? I sometimes get asked very bluntly, how do we know the election wasn't hacked or the outcome wasn't altered by flipping votes or what have you? And so folks should know that, like, before any voting system can be used by any county, especially in California, they have to be tested and certified first, right? So we have our security requirements that they all have to meet, including being kept offline. We don't allow our voting systems to be connected to the internet. So we make it impossible to systematically hack or rig the vote outcome. Voter registration databases are separately. We do have online voter registration. So we need to make sure that we're keeping up with, all the state-of-the-art, firewall, encryption technology, et cetera, to be as secure as possible. But that's all very different than, influencing opinions and perceptions of the integrity of our elections. That's what we've learned a lot about manipulation, not just through social media, but especially through social media. So we want to encourage people to get their information about elections and voting from official, reliable, trusted sources, being their county elections department or the California Secretaries of State. Ultimately, it's about maintaining people's confidence in the elections. When we go vote, we want to make sure that, number one, our vote is counted and that it's counted as cast. And when results are announced, that we can have faith in their accuracy.
Thank you. So Mr. Levine told me about the last presidential election and how that was affected. How was disinformation used during the 2016 elections and thereafter?
Sure. No, really, I think that's an excellent question, and I can touch on at least a couple aspects of that. Right. One, we know that Russia, right, masqueraded, right, as American actors in a number of respects. Right. We know that in some cases tried to assume American identities. We know that they targeted certain groups of voters. Right. No group of voters was targeted more in the 2016 campaign by Russia than African Americans. We know that they intentionally, right, utilized and disseminated false information about how, where, and when to vote. And we know that there was an effort to try and make sure that such information, right, got out to tens of millions of individuals. And so, as I alluded to before, I think this was a comprehensive, right, information campaign, but I'll be real honest in sort of saying that obviously this was, in some respects, maybe the first time the U.S. was dealing with this, right, in an election in this kind of manner. But, this activity from Russia, frankly, has been going on, at least in this kind of way, since 2014 in Ukraine, right, and has continued obviously since the 2016 U.S. election in places like, right, France during their 2017 elections, as well as a whole host of other countries. And so, these kinds of foreign influence operations are comprehensive in nature and are ongoing. And I will say, just to add on to that, they're continuing obviously today. One of the things, though, I think that's been a little different is we're seeing a bit more sophistication, not only from Russia, but other adversaries, including Iran and China. One of the other things I think that's worth noting is in many cases, our adversaries recognize that there's so much disinformation that's circulating domestically that simply being able to amplify it in just the right way and right time could be as successful as some of the tactics that were employed in 2016.
And do you have anything to add, Secretary Padilla?
No, just, again, I think at the end of the day, what folks who would seek to undermine our democracy whether they're foreign actors, and right, it may have started with Russia in the 2016 election, and it's no longer just them. Personal opinion, because of the lack of appropriate accountability for what they did in 2016. But there's also been a lot of divisiveness domestically as well. Look at the political environment that we're in. And so now foreign actors and others are manipulating those dynamics through amplification and other things. So at the end of the day, it's all about a matter of people having confidence in the integrity of our elections, which they should. Educate yourself about what states and local governments are doing to protect the integrity of our election, like testing certification of our equipment, like the use of paper ballots, and keeping our voting systems offline, and post-election audits, all the mechanical things that we do to ensure the integrity of the electoral infrastructure, and at the same time trying to be mindful and thoughtful about how we engage in civic dialogue. So I think that's one of the big reasons we're having this conversation today, because people should know how to interpret the information that they come across, what may be real, what may be not, and just the fact that we have to have this conversation is a reflection of, there's too many folks out there calling it into question when they deserve to have confidence in the electoral process.
Julie, I just want to hop on just two quick things the Secretary said. One is that the National Association of Secretaries of State since November of 2019 have had a Trusted Info 2020 campaign, of which the Secretary is a part of. And that's a really important place that folks can go to be getting accurate and timely information about the elections. And that is particularly important, right, during the coronavirus pandemic, where there's some uncertainty, right? Uncertainty about public health and best practices, uncertainty about maybe how elections are going to be administered come November. And so I think that's really important. I think the second thing, just to touch again on and expand a little further on what the Secretary pointed out, is election officials since 2016 have taken a number of steps to secure their elections. And just real quick three, just to really underscore what the Secretary said. Number one, you're seeing an increasing number of places that are moving to paper-based voting systems, and we expect to see upwards of 92%, if not more, because of the pandemic. And for the reasons the Secretary said, that's really important, right? Because number one, voters can check their ballots. Number two, you have the ability to be able to audit the election after the fact. And then in addition to that, we see more and more jurisdictions enacting stricter chain of custody protocols. And that's really important because you want to make sure that obviously what goes on election day is on the up and up. What gets tabulated is okay, but what goes on in between is good as well. And so I just wanted to, I know the Secretary is trying to be modest and humble, but, I'm happy to sort of, help amplify some of that too.
Thank you.
Yes, California's trying to lead the way.
That's great. So as you were mentioning a few of the ways that election vulnerabilities are being mitigated, is there any other ones that are stemming from this?
I think because of the 2016 election experience, all the chatter about potentially hacking or rigging the election. In California, we did sort of a top to bottom review of all of our infrastructure, starting at the state level, the Secretary of State's office, even as simple as upgrading servers and firewall technology, instituting 24/7 monitoring systems on our registration database, et cetera. But I think even more so working in partnership with counties, because we set a lot of policy at the state level. We do a lot of voter education at the state level, but it's each and every county that prints ballots, distributes ballots, collects ballots, counts ballots, and then audits the ballots. So we need to make sure that every county has implemented all the security best practices as well. And that's led to even deeper working relationships for elections officials at all levels of government. And a big piece is what we're doing today, making sure that the general public is informed as to the measures that we're taking and why they should have the confidence in the elections that they deserve to have.
I couldn't agree further with those points, and I can just expound on a couple. I think, number one, you're seeing election officials across the country, right, helping ensure that they have backup systems. We joked before, right, having backups to backups, and I think it's really important, right? We see an increasing number of jurisdictions that they have electronic poll books, right, or laptops with the lists of registered voters so that when you come to the polling place on election day, you get checked in. We see an increasing number of those jurisdictions having paper backups so that if there are any kinds of technical or nefarious issues, there's a backup there. We see an increasing number of jurisdictions that are utilizing and making sure that they have extra paper ballots so that if they have a piece of voting equipment that becomes inoperable, either for nefarious or other reasons, you can continue that voting process without much delay, right? And of course, we're seeing, I think, an increasing number, at least in my anecdotal experience, of jurisdictions making sure that they have adequate numbers of provisional ballot supplies so that if there are questions that arise, right, about potentially, for example, voter registration data being modified or altered, right? Again, folks have the ability to be able to cast a ballot in a quick manner, and then election officials have the ability to do some due diligence afterwards to verify that that vote should be counted. And so I think we're seeing election officials, even in this difficult environment, continuing to come up with ways, right, to ensure that even if their primary way of conducting the vote doesn't go through exactly as planned, they have a backup plan and a backup plan after that to try and make sure that this election goes off well.
And that last piece about provisional ballots, I think, is hugely important, both on its own, right? In California and many states, if there's some issue, your name's not on the roster, or equipment breaks down, or what have you, there's still an opportunity for a voter to cast their ballot, and administrators just verify it on the back end before counting that ballot. Sadly, that's not the case in every jurisdiction, in every state across the country, but it is in California. And I emphasize that because for all the talk there is about election security to protect against, foreign interference or, cyber threats or voter fraud, that's a term that's thrown around a little too loosely these days. We can't make our elections so secure that they're no longer accessible because a lot of times election security is used as a pretext for intentional and unintentional voter suppression, right? Our democracy functions best when as many people participate. So we take security and integrity very seriously. We have to make sure our elections are as accessible as possible with as many opportunities for eligible citizens to register easily and cast their ballots easily. And if we need backups and backups to the backups, then that's what we need to do out of respect for voting rights.
That's great to hear. And as we were mentioning, considering the current situation in the world, how is information being manipulated during the pandemic specifically, and who is doing this?
Well, I'll take the first bite at that apple. I think most of my colleagues around the country are committed to doing the right thing by way of voters, right? How do we make sure our elections are accessible, as I just mentioned, are as secure as we've been talking about, but are also safe from a health perspective given the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a no-brainer for most of us, strong consensus that we should expand vote by mail, no excuse vote by mail to every eligible voter in the nation, something California and many states already have, because there's no more convenient and safe way to vote than from the comfort and safety of your own home. But we want to couple that with safe in-person opportunities to vote for people who may need that. But voting by mail should be the first choice. But sadly, vote by mail has come under attack. And I'll be blunt, it's come under a partisan attack, from the Oval Office and a few others, despite the fact that vote by mail has been proven and successful for decades, and not just in states like California, but in red states and blue states and purple states. We know that it works, we know it's safe, we know that it's secure, but people are trying to manipulate misinformation about vote by mail to undermine confidence in vote by mail. So we're going to have to work hard to make sure we correct the record, that we educate voters not just of their rights and opportunities, but that they should have confidence in vote by mail because it's going to be the safest way to go this November.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Obviously, the Secretary covered a lot of it, particularly on the domestic side of things, right? At ASD, we obviously are focused primarily on authoritarian regimes, right? And what they're trying to do, countries like Russia, China, and Iran. We know that since the pandemic came ashore that there's been some narrative convergence from the three of them on trying to undermine the United States and its democracy utilizing the pandemic. We know that Russia has sort of continued to be sort of critical of the United States and tried to be critical about its response to the pandemic. We know that China in Iran, for example, have used, I think, the U.S. the federal government's public health response as another example of, right, the country and its inability to ensure that everyone is sort of treated adequately. But even more concretely with regards to the election, we've seen at least Russia and Iran suggest that delays in election results, right, are evidence or prima facie evidence of electoral corruption, right? And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, one of the things I think that's really important to emphasize, and whether we're talking about in California or a whole host of other states, is that in fact, let me say two things. One, it's likely that we'll have election results, right, take a little longer to come up with, or a bit longer than we have in previous elections. And number one, I would say that actually suggests that we're trying to be mindful and careful about how we're tabulating the results. And number two, people shouldn't assume that because it's taking longer, it means there's any kind of nefarious conduct afoot. And so I think that's really important. And then I think to the Secretary's point, one of the things that we're also at ASD tracking, right, is the concerns that adversaries could amplify, right, domestic mis and disinformation, again, to sow chaos and confusion in an attempt to undermine, right, the democracy, right. And one of the real things that we're trying to do at ASD, along with a whole host of others, is to try and make sure that folks are getting to trusted sources with regards to the election, and that all of those that contribute to sharing information about elections, whether it's election officials, reporters, folks like you, right, understand how this election may play out, right, and what information you need to be sharing with others so that folks can feel confident about how the 2020 election is being administered.
Thank you. So we just talked about information manipulation in terms of flaming the two sides of parties in politics and amplifying divisions while also giving false information to prevent people from voting. This seems to be a problem that social media companies are really struggling to deal with right now. And now I'm turning it over to my fellow colleague and Sierra College student, Camelia.
Thank you, Yulia. Secretary Padilla, I understand that the California legislature has appropriated $3 million to combat misinformation and strengthen cybersecurity. What did California establish with these funds?
Thank you. Yes, again, California trying to be on the forefront across the country in how we combat election misinformation and disinformation online. So starting a couple of years ago, the legislature and the governor have funded an Office of Election Cybersecurity, which, yes, is in part technical, right, reviewing the technical infrastructure of elections to make sure we are as secure as possible. But the bigger challenge, frankly, is in the communication space. When people come across erroneous information, intentional or otherwise, it could be hurtful. So with that funding, we've also established a lot of monitoring capability with human eyeballs and some of the software programs that are out there to try to identify erroneous information that exists digitally about elections. We have established protocols with the Facebook and Twitters and Instagrams of the world, so that as we come across information that we know is wrong, we can quickly report it to them, have officials from those social media platforms do a quick review. In the 2018 general election, say about 98% of what we reported was pretty much immediately taken down for violating the terms of those social media platforms. We also invite the public to participate. This is all part of our Vote Sure initiative. We have a dedicated email address where if you come across something that may look suspicious to you online about voting and elections, you can report it to us, and we can again bring it to the attention of the social media platform. So these are just some of the examples of the tools that we established with the funding of our Office of Election Cybersecurity. Part of it is cybersecurity from a technical infrastructure standpoint, but a lot of it really has to do with combating misinformation.
Thank you. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because my next question was if people can report misinformation and what people can do in response to misinformation on social media. Now that we've covered how California is combating disinformation, let's talk about California's election equipment. California does not connect voting machines to the internet. Is that true? And if so, why is this the case?
So that is absolutely true. With the biggest reason being security. And so, one of the questions I get asked pretty regularly is, when will we be able to just vote online or email in our votes? Not anytime soon, because of the vulnerability in the way the internet is structured. So there is room for a lot of technology to improve voting, the voting experience, and transparency. But when it comes to casting our ballot, it's going to continue to be on paper ballots. So I guess a couple of things people should keep in mind. Voting systems have to be tested and certified first to make sure they meet our security standards, and California has higher security standards than the rest of the nation. We prohibit the connectivity that I mentioned, and we require paper ballots. California law requires paper ballots and a voter verifiable paper audit trail. Those paper ballots are important not just to get the count right the first time, but a recount if necessary, and to fulfill the post-election audits that are required of every county after every election to ensure the accuracy and the integrity of the results. So a big policy framework that guards the integrity of our elections.
That's awesome. Domestically in California, is there the electronic transmission of ballots?
In California, it's very limited, the electronic transmission of ballots, and it's very specific to military and overseas voters. At times can receive their ballot by email, but they still have to print it out to fill it out and then return it back to county elections officials for tabulating. And in some areas, we've been piloting electronic delivery of ballots to individuals with disabilities. But by and large, the vast majority of ballots are paper ballots.
And what is being done to ensure that our election equipment isn't outdated, and what safeguards have been put into place?
Yeah. So again, having learned a lot from the 2016 experience, one of the measures that I took as Secretary of State was to decertify some of the older voting systems that were still in use in California. And so as we enter the November 2020 election, every single county has either upgraded or replaced their voting systems with modern, newer systems that have been tested and certified to meet our newer, higher standards. So it was very difficult to do. It wasn't cheap, but I think the Governor Newsom and Governor Brown prior to him, and the legislature for seeing the wisdom of that and including funding for that in the state budget. There's been some small federal appropriations that have assisted as well, so I want to give credit where credit is due, but it's frankly California's state leadership that enabled us to be in this position from a security and reliability standpoint going into this very consequential election.
Thank you. That is very reassuring to hear. And now back to Yulia, who will continue talking about securing elections and taking further action. Yulia?
Thank you, Camelia. So correct me if I'm wrong, Secretary Padilla and Mr. Levine. It is my understanding so far that when dealing with equipment and cybersecurity, money is needed. So in March, Congress passed and President Trump signed the CARES Act, which allocated $400 million in grants to states to run their elections during the pandemic. How much of this did California actually receive?
So California's share, I want to say it was about $36 million plus or minus in that range. And so again, it was helpful. I don't want to say it wasn't helpful, but we certainly need a lot more to do all the things that we need to do to continue to invest in the security and accessibility of our elections. And I want to put that recent federal appropriation in context. The last time there was significant investment in our nation's elections administration was right after the Florida 2000 presidential debacle, when Congress, on a bipartisan basis, I should mention, appropriated billions of dollars across the country for modernization and improvement of our elections. That was nearly 20 years ago. And technology has come a long way. Congress did a lot more in response to butterfly ballots and hanging chads, if you remember that Florida experience, than we've done in response to 2016 foreign interference in our elections, or than they've done in preparation for the November 2020 elections during a global health pandemic. So again, that money is appreciated, it's helpful, but not nearly enough. And investing in elections only once every 15, 20 years is not an option going forward. We need to invest more regularly in our elections infrastructure.
So ultimately, how much money is needed to secure our elections in California? Can you give me an estimate?
Yeah, and it's hard to pin down a specific dollar figure because at least in California, much better than a lot of other states, we've enjoyed the support of our state government through the state budget. So we're in a lot better position today. I think the biggest message I would have from a funding standpoint is much more consistent and regular funding. If it's not $1 billion once every 15 years, I'd rather take maybe $500 million in federal appropriations each and every year. If state and local elections officials knew they can count on that consistent level of support, I think it'd be much easier to make the improvements necessary and maintain them as necessary consistently.
Great. So you mentioned that each state is resourced differently. How would ongoing federal funds help the states in securing elections specifically?
Well, there's both the dollar amounts that could and should be included in every federal budget. And in addition to that, this is just Alex Padilla talking. I also think there's additional roles for federal leadership on this. I mean, elections are administered by states. That's clear in the Constitution, but Congress can and has in the past added some requirements for how elections are conducted. We can go back to the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and a couple of times that it's been renewed. We can go to both the Help America Vote Act or the National Voter Registration Act. So Congress could condition some of future funds to make sure things like no excuse vote by mail is available to all eligible voters in the country, or could require all states to offer in-person early voting for 10 days, 20 days in advance of every election. Congress could condition funds to make sure that states are implementing automatic voter registration, for example. There's no prohibition. Many states already have it. We know it's helpful both for voters and for the accuracy of our voter rolls, but too many states simply resist because they don't want to be told what to do, and the people who are ultimately hurt are voters themselves.
Right, definitely. So is Congress working on any bills to secure more money for elections during the pandemic?
So yes, the House of Representatives has actually passed a couple of measures to invest, I believe it's in the area of about $3.6 billion in elections nationally. There seems to be a bottleneck in the U.S. Senate where they've just been very reluctant, very reticent to do anything in the elections modernization or election security space. They've only been approving the drips and drabs of the $400 million here, which sounds like a big amount, but once you divvy it up across the 50 states, it's not really anywhere near what is needed. So I think the framework is there. There's bipartisan support on the Senate side, but we need the leadership in the U.S. Senate to allow the measure to come forward for a vote.
Just to add to the Secretary's point about that $400 million figure, right? Our organization, the Brennan Center for Justice, right, R Street and Pitt Cyber, so it's a bipartisan group, I did a report where we found that 5 states, right, Georgia, Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, and Pennsylvania, needed more than $400 million amongst themselves in order to be able to secure their election. So, and that's on top of, right, the federal funding that had already been distributed through the CARES Act. So I think, right, to the Secretary's point, that puts that in perspective. And to sort of add to the Secretary's point, and something I touched on in congressional testimony last week, right, there are a series of ongoing efforts to secure the election, right, that, particularly against the ongoing threat of foreign interference, that many states and localities are in a real difficult position to continue doing. Right? One example of this is we've seen a number of states across the country that have cyber navigator programs, right, begun in Illinois and in other places. And these are, right, efforts to basically put in IT and cyber professionals to go to election offices and ensure that their physical and cyber infrastructure are up to date, right? And that any vulnerabilities that might exist are identified and then subsequently remedied. Well, you know, in many cases, federal funds were used to start those programs up. If federal funds aren't used to keep them ongoing, then states and localities are going to have to dip into their coffers amidst declining revenues during this pandemic to try and sustain them. And that's a really difficult challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. So we began this conversation mentioning the three types of threats: voter fraud, voter suppression, and election interference. We've talked mostly about election interference so far. Voter fraud, however, seems to be used as an umbrella term for these three threats. Let's differentiate election interference from voter fraud. So could we define what is voter fraud specifically?
Want to go first, David?
Secretary, I'll let you take the first swing at that.
Sure. Look, I think the term voter fraud, you're right. Yeah, it's used way too loosely these days. But I think if I give people the benefit of the doubt, they're trying to refer to basically cheating in elections, right? Are there people who may not be eligible, that are breaking the law by registering to vote and casting ballots, those sorts of things. And the fact of the matter is, voter fraud is exceedingly rare, not just in California, but across the country. There's a number of reports, a number of studies, a number of investigations that have been done, and it shows that voter fraud, like I said, is exceedingly rare. Something in the area of, correct me, David, 0.00006% of the ballots cast in the last 20 years. And so it's real. We take it seriously, and that's why a lot of safeguards are in place to ensure the integrity of the election, like signature verification for vote-by-mail ballots, or protocols to keep people from being able to vote in person and vote by mail. Those sorts of things. And so sadly, what we hear in a lot of other states is the concern about voter fraud as a pretext to impose requirements on participating in elections that has the effect of keeping people from being able to participate. One of the most common ones, in my opinion, is these voter ID laws that are written very intentionally to say, in some states, Texas, and I think it's North Carolina as well, where your concealed weapons permit is an acceptable identification for being able to vote. But your state university student ID, right? That's a state issued ID, but that's not on the acceptable list to be able to vote. So, voter ID laws, the purging of voter rolls, the elimination of polling places in certain areas, all these policies have a disproportionate effect of keeping young people, communities of color, and working class communities from having the same access to the ballot than others.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add to the Secretary's point, other than to both reaffirm the fact that, right, we've seen countless studies done on this issue, right, in both Republican and Democratic administrations, right. We know that this is an exceedingly rare thing, right. At ASD, what we're often focused on, right, because of how we tackle these issues, right, is looking at how that might be amplified, right, or used to keep people from turning out to vote. And of course, one of the things I think that was really effective in the 2016 election was we saw, right, Russia do a lot of targeting, right, around, for example, the African-American community, in terms of, among other things, right, efforts to try and impact, right, their ability to turn out to vote, right, and in fact suppress that vote. And so, something that we remain mindful of, but, at the end of the day, facts matter. And it's really important, right, that we're all singing from the same sheet of music when it comes to what the facts are regarding our elections, both because we need them to be administered well, but also we need to make sure that they're secured properly. And that includes, to the Secretary's point, not only the infrastructure, but making sure that the information environment, right, is being flooded with accurate, dependable information so that voters can make informed judgments and cast ballots successfully.
So maybe you can answer my next question, Mr. Levine. Usually people think of voter impersonation when speaking about voter fraud. What is voter impersonation then?
I think, just real quickly, I think voter impersonation, right, is the ability to try and cast a ballot, right, as someone else. And again, this is something where, we've seen extensive studies that have been done on this kind of conduct, and we know that this kind of thing is exceedingly rare, right? You don't have to count or look to me for that. You can read the number of studies that are out there. I think it's also worth noting that many states and jurisdictions have significant penalties, both financial as well as potential jail time, for engaging in that kind of behavior. And you have to think about, right, all the steps that one might go through, right, to try and cast a ballot. Hoping that person, by the way, doesn't show up to vote, all to cast one vote, right, for an election where the outcome is likely to be much greater than that. And so, I think, again, this is an issue that I think folks talk about, but I think it's dwarfed, right, by the issue of foreign interference, and that's part of the reason why our organization, right, focuses like a laser on that issue and maybe less so on some others.
As you were mentioning about checks and balances, like penalties that states some have, what are the checks and balances in place for preventing voter impersonation here in California?
Yeah. No, so again, it's just keeping this all in perspective. After study after study, investigation after investigation, report after report, we know that voter fraud in its many forms is exceedingly rare. And so what that tells me is the current security measures and safeguards are working. And so for people who are trying to insist on more limitations, more restrictions that are concerned for voter fraud, in many ways, these are solutions in search of a problem. But look, we do take it very seriously in California and have laws in the books, to bring about the consequences for people who may want to unfairly influence the elections through fraud. And so both at the county level, a lot of county district attorneys can and do investigate reports of potential voter fraud in its various forms. At the state level, when we get information with some sort of allegation, and it's got to be backed up with some sort of evidence, some sort of proof, not just I think, or anecdotal evidence. We do have the ability to investigate through the Secretary of State's office, and depending on what we find, maybe refer something to a district attorney for investigation or prosecution, or to the Attorney General's office at the state level. But again, from our experience, it's a lot more anecdotal and perceived than it is real.
So far, this seems to me to be a tedious crime to commit for very little gain. It is high risk and low reward. Moreover, there have been a number of studies done that have shown that there's no large-scale voter fraud happening. And we have posted these studies on Sierra College's website for those who are interested. And this concludes our webinar about election cybersecurity, and I wanted to thank Secretary of State Padilla and Mr. Levine for taking time to join our webinar and shine some light on what is actually happening with cybersecurity during the elections period. For more information, please look into Secretary of State website at sos.ca.gov and sierracollege.edu/vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.